There are many other things that I could say about Sir Andrew Motion, but I think you've come here to hear him rather than me, and so I therefore take great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, in inviting to deliver this, the 6th BP Cultural Visions Lecture, Sir Andrew Motion.
That's an incredibly nice introduction. Thank you very much. I always think that when people are introducing me, the last sentence that looms in everybody's mind is, shortly after that he died. But I'm, as far as I'm aware, I haven't yet. It's really a treat to be back in Hull. Thank you so much for giving up your evening to come and listen to me. I've made various visits back, but always short ones since I stopped working at the university here in 1980. But as it happens, I've been here this whole past week making a film with some guys who are somewhere in the audience about Philip Larkin. And in the process of making the film, I've had a lot of time to see the city more widely than I have done for a long time, many years. And its transformation is extraordinary. And if I had, as I was saying to Rosie while we were waiting to come in, if I had to put that change in one sort of phrase, it would be to do with the way in which people seem to be talking to each other more now than they were before. And if that's what culture does, let's have more of it. So, well done, Hal. I realise, of course, and you've just been reminded, that what I'm going to say tonight forms part of a series of talks in which creators of various kinds have spoken about, quote, the power of the idea, the current of creativity and the source of inspiration. That's what Marianne's kind letter of invitation said to me at the beginning of this, before adding that the letter hopes that speakers are happy to share their own personal journey, discuss what inspired them to follow their career in the arts, and talk about the challenges and the obstacles they faced and how they shaped them into the person they are today, which is all very fine and enticing. But by my count, there are at least 8 big subjects there. And when I began thinking about what I might say to you, I realised that if I were to try and address them all, I'd be bound to end up doing no more than scratching a few surfaces. It would be better, I thought, to seize one subject in particular and see if it doesn't lead me into significant territory. I'm going to try and work out what made me a poet in the first place, the source of inspiration, in the terms of the letter, and say something about how whatever that was has remained with me throughout my subsequent life, how it has shaped my career, if you like, though to my mind the words poet and career don't really belong in the same sentence, because whereas poets are chosen by the muse, by fate, by the gods, by DNA, and by accidents both happy and unhappy, careers are things we tend to choose for ourselves. I dabbled in verse and it became my life, said the Irish poet Patrick Kavanagh. Quite so. In other words, you're in for a slice of autobiography. And because I believe the most decisively shaping things in our lives happen near the beginning of our time on earth, it's a slice taken entirely from my first 23 years, which is to say, my life up to the moment I arrived in Hull and became a wage-earning adult. I'll talk for about 50 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions, which I'll take myself. If you want to use these questions as a chance to drag me closer to the present day, I'll be very happy to let that happen. I'm a baby boomer, born almost exactly 65 years ago, when my brewer father and housewife mother were living in a mill house in Hertfordshire. 3 years later, soon after my younger brother Kit came along, they moved 30-odd miles north to the then small village of Hatfield Heath, also in Hertfordshire, fearing that if they stayed in the mill house any longer, I might drown in the mill stream. Hatfield Heath, and a house already but happily called Little Brewers, happily because of my father's profession, was the place where I first became conscious of myself. But already, and even using so innocuous a phrase as that, I feel I'm back by a mill stream again and likely to tumble in. What do I mean? What does anybody mean when they talk about themselves? Do I mean the self that I began to devise in order to cut through the air of the outside world? Or do I mean the self that I began to experience in private, which lacked all the confidences of its alter ego? The answer, of course, has to be both. But the fact is, and despite vulnerabilities, the private self felt, as I'm sure it does for all of us, far more like my real self since it wasn't shaped and therefore wasn't compromised by any overriding wish to please or conform or mask. I wasn't thinking of poetry at the time, of course, but I suppose you could say that this sense of secret authenticity is all of a piece with Wallace Stevens' insistence that the poet refuses to allow his task to be set for him. What I'm trying to say here is that my strongest feelings as a child, my strongest ideas about who I was, had nothing to do with what we now call entitlement. They were primitive in opposite ways. They were feelings of jealousy of my brother, mainly, of fear of my dad, who was loving but agitated, undemonstrative man, whom I can now see had been seriously screwed up by his own distant parents and his time fighting in Europe after landing in France on D-Day, of blind love for my mother, and of strong but murky affection for the ground beneath my feet. Although my father commuted to London for his brewery work every weekday, he was, like my mother, a country person. We lived quietly and out of the way. Our friends were farmers, and so were my grandfather and my uncle farmers. We had a sizable menagerie of dogs and cats and horses and guinea pigs and goldfish. We made a religion of walking. We were English, as my father used to say, which paradoxically meant, among other things, that we spent our summer holidays in Ireland or Scotland. I didn't go properly abroad, until I was 15. What has all this got to do with the idea of creativity and the source of inspiration? Everything and nothing. Everything because it was the bedrock. Nothing in the sense that my father, who tended to call the shots at home, had no time for the arts. I mean, they just were not on his radar. My mother read a bit, Iris Murdoch, that sort of thing, liked the ballet in theory, but so far as I can remember, only went to see it once, and sometimes listened to pieces from the classical music top 10. My father had some sort of logophobia. He once told me towards the end of his life, he once told me he reckoned he'd read half a book in his entire life. The Lonely Skier by Hammond Innes, which somebody must have told him was a thriller, but evidently not very thrilling for him. This meant there were only a handful of books at home, The Lonely Skier, of course, the autobiography of Sir Francis Chichester, an unread copy of C.P. Snow's Corridors of Power, and a fat brick bound in dark green leather called Jock of the Bushveld, which was about a dog. It meant that theatre was an annual trip to London at Christmas to see a pantomime. It meant I never once went to an art gallery or a museum with either of my parents. I'm not saying this to make myself sound hard done by. I was not hard done by. My parents were kind people, but they, and especially my father, were predominantly old school rural. They hadn't been to university and vaguely looked down on people who had. They were stiff upper-lipped. They were conservative, large and small c, and they were distrustful of anything artsy or intellectual. And speaking of school, so was my first school, old school, a converted country house in the Northamptonshire countryside, 90 miles away from my home in Essex, complete with turrets and cabbage-smelling corridors, run by a friend of my father's father's girlfriend, who, like most of his staff, was a barely repressed paedophile, an enthusiastic flogger of young male bottoms. I'm not exaggerating. Philip Larkin tells us that life is first boredom, then fear. This exactly reverses my own experience. The nervousness I often felt around my father, was he going to lose his temper? How could I gain his approval? Was magnified 1,000-fold during my time at this school, the ironically named Maidwell Hall, where I arrived age 7 and remained for 6 years. 6 very influential years, but not in a way that I like to describe. Maidwell shaped me in decisive ways, not because I found a wonderful, good parent substitute. The English teacher obviously thought I had something, but that something was in my trousers and not in my head. Not because I suddenly discovered the joy of learning. I learned almost nothing in my classroom time. My brain was an impermeably frozen lump of fearfulness. Not because a vitalizing dose of cultural succour was dribbled amidst the stony blocks of rote learning. There was an idiotic musical appreciation class, but that was it as far as the arts were concerned. And not because I made an especially close saviour friend. By and large, we boys were encouraged to compete with one another for everything and not to bond. Maidwell influenced me because I was bitterly homesick there. In particular, its routines made me feel that every good and happy time in my life, the holidays, would very soon come to an end and turn into a bad and unhappy time, the terms. In other words, it cultivated in me a profoundly elegiac attitude to life by making me think that time was really a chain of separations disappointments, deprivations and losses, which could only be occasionally and briefly interrupted. And I have to say, while wincing slightly at the melodrama of such a statement, that although I've often been much happier since I left Maidwell, my fundamental sense of things hasn't changed that much. In fact, I'd say it had only deepened as my understanding of what it means to live in time has deepened. Was it this enforced early adoption of an elegiac structure that turned me into a poet? It's not the kind of question I can answer accurately, although I can certainly say that it shaped my taste in poetry when a few years later I began to have a taste that was capable of being shaped. What I mean is, when I read the big, sad poets for the first time, Wordsworth and Tennyson and Christina Rossetti and Keats and Hardy and Edward Thomas and, yes, Larkin, I thought, they understand. Life is like that. In other words, the primitive feelings that filled me as a child led to an equally primitive need for those feelings to be confirmed and validated as an adult, and to a deep delight in finding out how poetry can do that. There was something else too about Maidwell. The sinister headmaster was a passionate gardener. Orchids were his speciality, and the large garden surrounding the school was an easy place to admire. It didn't have the wildness I'd already learned to love at home, the deep cups of champagne cow parsley that shimmered up in summer at the garden end, the holly hedge where blackbirds nested, the laurel bush trimmed over the years into a tunnel shape that only children were small enough to enter, the greenhouse with its thick, green, damp, dizzy-making tomato smell. It didn't have any of those secret and sensational places, but it was impressive all right, and it was a refuge, somewhere I could escape the swipes of my teachers and the shouts of my peers, somewhere I could feel safe enough to be watchful of the world around me without feeling that I was about to get into trouble. To this extent, the sense of pleasure and the sense of refuge combined with one another. If I'd read Wordsworth by then, and despite the enormous differences between the landscapes in which we grew up, his properly wild and northern, mine predominantly suburban and southern, I would have known exactly what he meant in his great long poem, The Prelude, when he talks about being fostered, that's his word, as a child by beauty and by fear. The garden at Maidwell, like the places to lurk and ramble at home, were also important because they gave me the peace to talk to myself. I don't mean to dissect and analyse things that were happening to me. I mean to float in the dark tank of my own mind, wishing for things I didn't have, imagining places I'd rather be. As this implies, I did this talking, as perhaps most children do, without paying much attention to words, but relying on my senses instead. A poem begins with a lump in the throat, says Robert Frost, a love sickness, a homesickness. This catches exactly the kind of thing I mean, a pre-articulate and in a way painful appetite to say something that has a shape and mood and character, but exists at a depth below or outside the bubble of language and conscious meaning. This pre-articulate state, with its connotations of vision and dream and haunting, is of course something the best poetry finds intensely alluring. But when I can see now that it formed a seedbed for poetry in my life, poetry itself had nothing to do with it at this stage. Poetry was simply not something I considered, except when I had to discuss it in one of my English classes, or learn it as a punishment, which is how I made my first acquaintance with the likes of Hilaire Belloc and Walter de la Mare. But apart from that, nothing. No one at Maidwell let me think that poetry might have something to do with delight, or that its rhythms might be like the beat of my own pulse and my heart, or that the things poetry said might help me understand where I belonged in life, or how someone who was not myself might view and comprehend the world. And yet, once again, it never occurred to me to think of this as some kind of deprivation. Because poetry was invisible at home, I saw no reason why it should be valued at school. So far as I was concerned, poetry was simply another cog in the machinery that ground out the daily obligations, traditions, punishments, and manners. We look at the world once, in childhood. The rest is memory. So says Louise Gluck, one of the best contemporary American poets. And I have to say I know what she means. As I've just said, I looked at the world in childhood, and I saw the shape of elegy, which I have never forgotten. But what I lacked was the means to express that elegy, the words to write it down. And I might very well never have found those words, had it not been for the life-changingly happy chance of encountering a great teacher at the school I was sent to after Madewell. When I arrived at Radley College, which is a very traditional, high Anglican establishment outside Oxford, my parents chose it because my uncle had been there. I was 13 years old. I expected the school to be an X-rated version of Madewell, and it's true to say that during the first 2 years that I was there, nothing happened to dispel that idea. Prefects were still licensed to beat junior boys, which they did nightly and with relish in the senior prefect's study. They were still fagging. I fagged for the head of my house, who was appropriately enough called Rogers, who made it my task every week to shine his shoes and clean his room and collect his copy of Playboy from the village shop down the road, then carry it back to him rolled up like a relay baton so nobody knew what it was. And the teachers, we called them Dons, which felt to me then like an appropriate blend of Oxbridge and the Mafia, but they were generally alarming and remote. At the end of those first 2 years, my history master asked everybody in the class what we wanted to do in later life. I said I wanted to be a priest because I was in the grip of adolescent religious mania, but also because I liked the idea of living in a remote rural parish with a congregation of about 6, and lots of time to enjoy country walks and bird watching, which had become my passion. Still, for all its alarms, Radley was a milder place than Madewell. And the lower fear factor meant that my mind began to unthaw. Not unthaw much, mind you. I bumped along near the bottom of all my classes except English, and scraped through a dismal 6 O-levels. My highest grade, the lowest was 6, was 5. For my A-levels, which would occupy me for 2 years before I set off to join the priesthood, I chose geography, which in those days had the reputation of being a thick person's subject, and history, because my first seriously good friend Sandy Nairn was doing it and I thought he could help me, and English because that was the thing I liked best and found easiest. It was the English classes where I found poetry, but before I say anything about them, I need to talk for a moment about Sandy. As many of you will be aware, he had in later life a very successful career as a curator and gallery director, spending a long time as Nick Serosa's right-hand man during the creation of Tate Modern, then being the director of the National Portrait Gallery. At the time of our first meeting, when we were 13, he was quite simply unlike anybody else that I'd ever met. For one thing, his family were professional. His father was a senior civil servant, rather than involved in business or farming. For another, he had a large family. There were 6 Nairn children. For another, and this was more important than anything, the whole lot of them, as I immediately discovered when I began visiting Sandy during the school holidays, talked about the arts as easily and often as my parents talked about the weather and the blacksmith. I had nothing to contribute to these conversations because I didn't know anything worth saying, but for the first time in my life, I could see how life might be otherwise. So it would be fair to say that the ground had been very well prepared by Sandy for the seeds shown by this English teacher I mentioned a moment ago. The English teacher whose name was Peter Way, and who in the first minutes of our time together in his A-level English class woke me up to poetry by introducing me to Thomas Hardy's great poem, I Look Into My Glass. I look into my glass and view my wasting skin and think, would God it came to pass my heart had shrunk as thin. For then I, undistressed by hearts grown cold to me, could lonely wait my endless rest with equanimity. But time, to make me grieve, part steals, lets part abide, and shakes this fragile frame at eve with throbbings of noontide. Well, I've said elsewhere that I felt this poem go into me, it still does it, like a spear. And once I've been skewered in this way, Peter had me at his mercy. It was with him that I read for the first time large chunks of Shakespeare, as well as poems from an anthology unsexily titled Theme and Variations, from which I still remember poems by Dryden, Pope, Wordsworth, Keats, Hopkins, Hardy, Edward Thomas, Eliot, Pound, Auden, Empson, Edwin Muir, Roy Campbell, Sylvia Plath, Larkin, and Laurie Lee. I think it's worth noticing briefly that this is a pretty eclectic collection of poets, which prompts me to add that I don't have a single memory from this time of anyone saying anything about having a preference for modernists or non-modernists, or about there being any kind of standoff between these two traditions. This seems peculiar in retrospect and a kind of glitch in my early literary education, but it had at least one great advantage. When it became clear to me that the greater concentration of my own interest lay with poets in what Donald Davie and others were later to identify as the English line, Wordsworth, Hardy, Thomas, Larkin, and so on. And when I realised that the kind of poetry I wanted to write would aim for simple language and pretty straightforward strategies, I never felt that I had to prize these poets and these elements of style to the exclusion of all others. Indeed, and I remember talking about this quite a lot during my time here at Hull, modernism and non-modernist writing, despite the mutually defiant postures struck by Pound and others on the one side and Larkin and others on the other side, seemed to me from my first acquaintance with it to be something best described as having certain characteristics to a particularly intense degree rather than as wholly different entities. And this in turn led me to feel that I could take whatever forms and terms and tones I liked from the great kit bag of poetry, rather than sticking to one kind of approach and one alone. My ambition right from the beginning, and this is something that I have said before, and I'm sorry to repeat myself, but it encapsulates something that I have been trying to do all my writing life, really. My ambition from the first was to write poems that looked like a glass of water but turned out to be gin. That begins to take me towards literary criticism, which isn't really the direction I want to take this evening. The point I'm trying to make about the influence of Peter Way is that everything he planted in me took root and grew. I liked the inwardness of poetry and the sense that it elicited a personal opinion, which, provided I paid attention to the signposts in the lines I was reading, couldn't be wrong in the way that I was invariably wrong in mathematics and other subjects. I liked the dainty game of poetic forms. I liked the wildness of throwing over these forms. I liked the unashamed way that poetry addressed itself to and expressed strong feelings. I liked the music and the dance and the play and the certainty that it made sense, but not in the way that an article in the newspaper made sense. I liked it for fitting its music to the beauty or the barbarity of its subjects. And I liked it for being unpopular. Other boys in my classroom might have preferred one poem to another, but most of them, and apparently most of the rest of the world, if my father was anything to go by, thought that poetry was a waste of time. In particular, they thought it was sissy, a girl's thing, which meant that for them, the only possible use it might have was to get a girl's attention, not in order to spend more time talking about poetry, but to put poetry aside at the first possible opportunity and move on to other sorts of communication. I suppose this same idea might have crossed my own mind, but at the time I wasn't very interested in girls. And anyway, as I say, I valued above almost everything else the sense that poetry was samizdat. It was a way of creating and registering a difference between myself and my family, between myself and the society of my upbringing. But it was also, and this was just as important, a means of beginning to speak about things in my upbringing that I wanted to preserve, things that had to do with the countryside. When I read Wordsworth and Hardy talking about their landscapes, my head flooded with memories of the sun-struck and silent oak woods near where we lived, the ford where the cattle crossed and turned the mud to chocolate, the sticklebacks under the bridge, the wheat fields where the wind dabbed its cat's paw. My head flooded, and I knew what Wordsworth and Hardy were on about. And in the process, I began to understand for the first time that when we read the poetry that means most to us, we almost never say to ourselves, "I've never thought that before." We think, "That's right." New thoughts may arise from this initial feeling of confirmation, new ways of perceiving the world and our place within it. But in the beginning, poetic pleasure is very powerfully to do with a sense of recognition, of seeming to be reminded of something we already knew at some previously unreachable deep level of ourselves. In this sense, Peter Way set me free from my past, while at the same time allowing me to preserve the parts of it that I would need for my future. He made me feel that poetry belonged within life, rather than being a weird carbuncle that teachers and others stuck on the side of life. By speaking quietly and intensely about poems, by poring over the question of why such and such a poet had chosen this particular word and not that particular word, by encouraging me to think about the metaphorical life of poems, by drawing attention to the ways in which poets generate emotional heat, which he insisted had as much to do with restraint as it did with letting it all hang out. He helped me to build the foundations on which I have built my existence. If I had to summarize his poetic taste in a phrase, it would be something from Book 8 of The Prelude. The phrase is, "Power growing under weight." That feeling of strength coming from concentration, attentiveness, distillation, force of mind, and the combined pressure of memory and the imagination. I'm saying all this to honour a good man and pay a debt, but also to confirm a pattern that I hope is now beginning to emerge in what I have to say. I'm not an especially gregarious person, but I have been unusually blessed by the friendships that I have made and by the influence that they have exerted on me. As my English coursework cross-fertilised with the books that Peter Way lent me to read in my private time, collections by Edward Thomas and Larkin are the two that I remember best. And as my conversations with Sandy led me to my first visits to art galleries, to listening to music, to beginning to be interested in socialist politics, so I felt my internal generator shudder into life and the lights in my brain flicker on. I began writing poems and showing them to Peter for his comments. I won the school poetry competition that meant a lot to me, though I now wonder whether anybody else went in for it. I began reading hungrily, biking into Oxford on Saturdays and standing in front of the poetry shelves in Blackwell's, not recognising any of the names I was staring at and making wild lunges. One week Robert Graves, the next week Vernon Watkins. What was I aiming to create when I was back at my desk? I had no clear idea, no firm grasp of form, no sense of an audience, and nothing like a statement to make. I was a kind of eruption, a word geyser, but I had strong feelings, the same boiling and steaming mess of strong feelings about belonging, status, and sex that exists in every adolescent, all enveloped by an equally strong idea that poetry could give them simultaneous release and government, and steady me by allowing me to look at what I had written and say to myself, I made that, I exist. Not much, you might think, on which to build the new identity I wanted, but apparently enough. When the time came for me to contemplate life after school, the recently appointed careers advice officer asked me what I wanted to do with myself, and I told him, twirling my imaginary cape, I am a poet. Well, there's nothing I can do for you then, he said, briskly, and dismissed me from the room. Sandy Nairn and Peter Way were both vital to me. Sandy still is. I'm staying with him next week. And Peter remained so until his death, aged 93 last year. But, and that but has no negative connotations, it's true to say that I found them both within the boundaries of my life, of the life my parents had drawn for me. They were both a consequence of my upbringing and the privileges that undoubtedly brought me. I have no doubt that their effect would have lasted for the rest of my life under any circumstances, but as it turned out, the next two important things that happened to me were bolts from the blue and made their existence and impact even more significant. First of these important things was illness. Halfway through my first A-level year, I developed a form of arthritis in my knee joints that put me in plaster for a while, which didn't have any beneficial effect, and then under the knife. This meant that I missed a couple of terms at school and recuperated at home, in the house that my parents had moved to in Essex, at the same time as I left Madewell, and which lay in the deeper countryside than any I'd known before. If you think of Constable's Dedham Vale and drop down about 20 minutes driving, it was there, it is there. And during that time I had weekly letters from Peter telling me what I might read and think about. I don't think anyone used the phrase, but it was a form of long-distance learning, and I did indeed learn a lot. I certainly read a lot. I learned even more, however, from living for a while outside the stream of things, in the secret-seeming and parallel time current, where I saw my mother alone for most of every day, talked with her as I had never talked before, and drew much closer to her than I would otherwise have found possible. I'd always adored her, but blindly, instinctively, almost unthinkingly. Now, on the cusp of my young manhood, I began to see what sort of individual person she was, how settled at home, but also how frustrated by it, how thwarted by never having been to university, how the few books she kept in the whirligig in the corner of the sitting room, and the records she sometimes played of Julius Katchen playing Beethoven piano sonatas, were the tip of a culture iceberg that she had never dived down to examine. As you can tell from the way I'm saying this, it occurred to me that by deepening my commitment to poetry, I was doing something for her as well as for myself. I was fortifying my own existence by living the life that she had not been able to pursue. I've sometimes wondered whether I didn't in some sense invent my illness in order to make a decisive break with my upbringing and establish a new identity. It would otherwise have been very difficult for me to cross my inheritance boundaries without triggering a sort of catastrophic family explosion that I preferred to avoid. As it was, I could plead aches and pains to get out of the things that my emerging self found difficult or actually repellent. I've no doubt that I was nauseatingly pretentious and stuck up, but no one could deny that I had illness on my side. I couldn't go to church because I couldn't kneel. I couldn't go riding because I couldn't ride. I couldn't join in the social life of my parents' friends and their children, whose politics and assumptions I now haughtily disliked, because I couldn't stand up. I could, on the other hand, lie down and read books. Which brings me to describe a moment that stays in my mind more powerfully than any other from this time. When I was sufficiently recovered from my operations, this would have been in the spring of 1969, and I was 16 and a half, I was encouraged to take long walks every day to get my legs working again. Usually I'd stride purposefully across the ponies field outside the house to prove to my mother that I was doing as I should, then disappear into the shadows of the wood that stood beyond the ditch in the far corner, a wood called the Ash Ground, and lie down among the bluebells to read whatever book of poems I'd stuffed into my pocket. Rimbaud, Verlaine, Baudelaire had all recently become my obsessions. On the particular day I'm thinking about, I must have been feeling lazy or perhaps just crocked. At any rate, instead of vanishing into the blue, I dragged a sun lounger onto the lawn outside the kitchen window and lay down to read there instead. Nothing French this time, but the poems of Andrew Marvell in the Muses Library edition that I'd recently bought in the local second-hand bookshop. I can feel it as I'm saying this, I can still feel the warmth of that day, still hear the hush of the breeze and the big laurel bush away to my right, and see the glare of the small, neat white page, and then the balm of the grass, and my mother's herbaceous border, and the hawthorn overshadowing, and the ash tree with its grey trunk. I was in a garden, reading the garden, and suddenly there was no difference between the two. Suddenly I was both anchored and deeply in the scene, yet weightless and floating. I was filled with delicious words, but speechless. I was more alive than I'd ever felt, and more crammed with knowledge, but at the same time extinguished and blank. I hadn't yet read James Joyce, but if I'd known to call it an epiphany, I would have done. And when I came back to myself, which must have been a very few moments later, I understood something about the nature of poetry that stayed with me ever since. In that brief visionary moment, I had seen that poetry placed me at a new and disconcerting angle to the world, while at the same time providing a profound feeling of completion. Wordsworth, again, knew what I'm talking about here, but if Wordsworth had been lying on that sun lounger, strange thought, he would have located his sense of something far more deeply interfused in the external world, the grass and the laurel and the hawthorn and the ash tree. I felt a quickened connection with these things and with the wider spaces beyond them, but I also felt I'd been vouchsafed a glimpse of a mystery within language. The fact, that language can establish a connection between itself and visible things, and simultaneously question, break, or actually deny that connection. A vision that I could spend the rest of my life trying to apprehend more clearly, which has always escaped me, but also always draws me on. Does this mean I suddenly began to think of the poet as some kind of prophet, as the Romantic poets had tended to do? No. That would have been, and to my mind still would be, too grandiose. But it did and does mean that I began to think of poetry as the medium to express in its purest form the heroic and tragic effort of humanity to catch an emanation of, well, what is the word for it? World essence. Life's redemption, Wallace Stevens calls it, and I can live with that. It also meant, once I'd begun to think about the paradoxes inherent in what I'd experienced, that I now had an idea of poetic creation that placed an equal emphasis on what can be known, the conscious mind managing questions of form and meaning, and what cannot be known, the unconscious mind delivering its murky cargo of life-created impressions and feelings, by making links, as the neurologist Nancy Anderson says in her wonderful book, The Creating Brain, between shadowy forms of objects or symbols or words or remembered experiences that have not previously been linked. Then came the second thing, the second bolt from the blue. 3 months after I was well enough to go back to school and rejoin my classes, my mother fell off her horse, which kicked out as she slipped down and struck her on the head. For the next 3 years she was unconscious. For the next 6 years after that, she hovered in the strange nowhere land that lies between life and death. She was conscious and able to speak in the last part of her life, but never left hospital, was completely paralysed, and had a very patchy memory. Every so often she would catch pneumonia, as frequently happens with immobilised patients. And in 1976, when I was in Hull, she died. What has this got to do with my life in poetry? Everything. My mother's accident turned my enthusiastic adolescent love for poetry into absolute and prematurely adult commitment. It threw down a subject I could not ignore and would never be able to exhaust. It established the basic principles of the belief system that still guides everything I write and do. My sense that human existence is a prey to random forces, and that we must acknowledge this randomness even while we try and establish clear lines of intention. It confirmed in the most horribly emphatic way that I'd been right to suppose the dominant note in life is elegiac. It cemented my loyalty to the big sad poets, who were already my favourites, because it confirmed my sense of them as truth-tellers. Tragedy is true, guys, as Hardy says. And it made me believe that poems might be, among other things, a form of compensation, a way of preserving memories and of pickling the past, but also, and with less danger of mere nostalgia, a form of resurrection, even perhaps a form of recompense, in the sense that my mother's accident made me imagine life as a set of scales, in one pan of which I saw all the dismal things, deaths and losses and destructions, and in the other pan of which I saw the opportunity to put the affirming things, love, kindness, humour, tolerance, good teaching, and good doctoring, and art. Art of all kinds, but for me, poetry in particular, because in my own case, as I've said, poetry was already a hotline to my most urgent feelings and my preferred way of trying to express the inexpressible. Do I mean that it was a form of therapy and has remained so? Maybe, but I'd have to say that whatever relief the writing of a poem has ever brought me has lasted for a very short time, and to add that while I have absolutely no doubt that poetry can be liberating and assuaging in some medical contexts, where its music and metaphors break through certain neurological barriers, I've never myself written exclusively or even primarily for therapeutic reasons. Whenever I've addressed subjects of a kind that might be imagined to have some of that component, such as the subject of my mother herself, my appetite for self-healing has always been subordinate to my wish to treat my own circumstances in a way that will allow others to identify with them. To catch my circumstances vividly, of course, because how otherwise would anyone be able to connect with them, but at the same time to transfigure them so that they become emblematic of the human condition as a whole. To believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men or women, that is genius, says Emerson. Well, I'm no genius, but I still think that's true. How much of this is wisdom after the event, if wisdom it be? I'm honestly not sure, but I do know that even in the immediate aftermath of my mother's accident, I had a very strong sense that I must somehow make things, create things, add to the world to compensate for the gap that her accident had created. Because words were the things that I had begun to enjoy and admire, I reached for them all the more urgently. In this respect, the accident made me vocal. It stiffened my resolve, it focused my ambitions, and, which is not an entirely easy thing to admit, by requiring me to be at home a good deal of the time, to help as a nurse, it also stimulated my appetite to stretch my wings, to assert my independence and make my own way. To put it bluntly, home was now just too unhappy to live in all the time. My last year at school was in this respect a kind of salvation, and so was university a salvation. University where I went in 1970, first in my father's family to do so, and gladly succumbed to a host of new influences. If I were to tramp through them all, I'd be talking all night. So I'm going to choose one set in particular which extends a path I've been trying to follow for the last few minutes and has to do with individuals. The first is Auden. At the end of my first year at Oxford, my then girlfriend and I, who were very keenly taken with the poems of Louis MacNeice, discovered that MacNeice's literary executor, the Greek scholar E.R. Dodds, was living in the neighbouring village of Marston. We invited ourselves to visit him, and over the next few months one thing led to another and we became friends. A year or so later, when Auden came to live for the winter in a cottage provided for him by Christchurch College, Dodds introduced me to him, explaining that I wrote poems myself. It's hardly an exaggeration to say that meeting Auden was for me like meeting God. I had fallen in love with his poems at school, spent more months than I care to remember writing things that were hopelessly enthralled to his melodies and themes. And although I'd finally convinced myself that we were different sorts of creature in many ways, I still had no doubt that he was the greatest living poet I'd read. I say this not just to remind myself how young, 20, and impressionable, very, I was back then, but also to make a point about the value of hero worship. When Auden proposed that we have weekly meetings in his cottage, where I would arrive very punctually, he was manic about punctuality, very punctually at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to talk about the poems I'd left with him the previous week, the mere fact that we would be spending time together mattered as much or more than whatever advice he might have given me. And he did give me good advice, especially about stretching my imagination, but not to the extent, he always insisted, of breaking any natural laws, and about using the whole toolkit of forms that are available to poets rather than sticking to free verse. But as I say, it was the influence of his presence that mattered most. The fact that he was kind to me, and also that he was visibly flesh and blood, astoundingly crumpled in his features, as you all know, and in his clothes, but also astoundingly messy, coffee rings and cigarette everywhere. That all mattered too. It brought poetry off the page and into life. It made it seem inseparable from dailiness, good dailiness, moments of inspiration, as well as bad dailiness, dull routines, regrettable obligations, accidents. It magnificently confirmed and enhanced the sense that Peter Way had instilled in me, the sense that poetry might be a criticism of life, but is also a part of life. If poetry come not as naturally as leaves to a tree, Keats says famously, it had better not come at all. Exactly so. I thought then, and I think now, that poetry is a completely natural thing, no matter how hard we might have to work to make it good. Primitive and natural as breathing. Auden showed me that with an authority I could not have found in anyone else. When Auden died the following spring, I felt as though someone in my family had died, someone I knew much better than was in fact the case. I also remember thinking, well, if I never meet another major poet in my life, at least I've met him. But I did meet another major poet. And before I come to him, I need to say something about Alan Hollinghurst, who I think is a major novelist. I met Alan halfway through my second year as a student, and we immediately became good friends, and immediately began sharing our work together, showing each other, in fact, our work as it came out at the end of our pens. We still do this. I was staying with him last week. We are soulmates 40 years later. In this respect, Alan and I warned him I was going to talk about it, so I'm not quite talking behind his back. But we are, in a sense, like a two-man creative writing course formed shortly before the invention of creative writing courses. We admire a lot of the same writers, we value the same qualities, we dislike many of the same things, and we think the same things are ridiculous or bad. And we also each like and know things that the other doesn't, which means that we can feel independent as well as shoulder to shoulder. If I could give a gift to every young writer, it would be the chance to have such a person in their lives, a person who could be at once ally and inspiration, comfort and challenge. Which brings me at long last to Philip Larkin. Because I'd admired his poems so much when I first read them as a teenager, it's fair to say that he was a major reason why I applied for the job that brought me here to work at the university in Hull in the autumn of 1976, after I had completed my thesis on Edward Thomas. But as I settled in here and was greeted by a chorus of voices, some of them voices of people sitting in this room, telling me that I'd never meet him because he hated everyone, and especially hated people who worked in the English department because we talked nonsensically about poetry. He meant literary theory. But I heard that, I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life and should have gone back to where I was before. But I hadn't made the biggest mistake of my life. There were certainly things about Hull that I never got used to, and equally certainly there were things that never got used to me. But I quickly started to feel very loyal to the place. I loved exploring the city and this part of the countryside. I made some very good friends. I learned a lot about literature and politics and life. And after about 2 months of holding off, I met Larkin. Despite all the dire warnings I had received, we soon became friends. And that's why I'm going to stop talking to you in this formal way and start taking questions. If it seems as though I'm leaving you with a cliffhanger, I suppose I am. But it has to be so because coming to Hull marked the end of the beginning of my life and the start of everything else. My time up to my arrival here had been the making of me. My time after my arrival here, the jobs that followed in other universities and in publishing and in the writing of books and the committee sitting and the laureateship, all that jazz, that's been an elaboration or an enlargement. I don't mean to say that some fundamental things haven't changed dramatically during this time. They absolutely have. My Korean wife and I now live in Baltimore. Believe me, my existence there feels a long way from Hull and even further from my beginnings in rural Essex. Neither do I mean to say that my thoughts about poetry and my tastes have stayed exactly the same. They've expanded and I hope deepened enormously. But I do mean that in my writing and in myself, I still feel entranced, informed, and exhilarated by my first sight of the world, and hope to remain so for the rest of my life. In my ending will be my beginning. Thank you. So if you have any questions, please do ask me. Yes, please.
What are you reading at the moment?
That's a very good question. Well, to tell you the honest truth, why should I tell you anything else? I'm rereading a lot of novels by Joseph Conrad, partly because the outrages in Manchester and London recently put me in mind of The Secret Agent. And it is astoundingly appropriate to the ghastly times that we're going through, that book. So I'm reading a lot of Conrad. Every year I read at least 2 or 3 of the same things that I particularly love again. So I read the Prelude, Wordsworth's Prelude every year. I actually just finished reading that. And I read Paradise Lost every year, and I just finished reading that. Aim high, eh? And I read as much Homer as I can sort of get to every year. He's a very... And I read them in what we think is the chronological order. So I read the Iliad first, and then I read the Odyssey. And these are books that I feel I know pretty well now. But every time I pick them up, I think, have I actually read this? In other words, they have an extraordinary capacity to renew themselves. And I read a lot of contemporary stuff as well, but I feel the need to kind of remind myself of those absolutely huge, great, fundamental things. And of all of them, actually, the one that I enjoyed most for the last few years, and especially this summer, that I've enjoyed rereading most is Paradise Lost. This time round, it really blew my head off. Absolutely amazing. It is an amazing thing. So yeah. One of the nice things about my new life in Baltimore actually is that I have much more time for reading. Fewer students, more solitary hours. I'm tempted to ask you what you're reading, but I can ask you that afterwards perhaps. Does anybody else want to say anything?
Do you read Homer in Latin or in translation?
I read it in translation. I'm sorry to tell you. Well, I'm not that sorry to tell you because there are so many good translations of it available now. I read the Fitzgerald translation. That's the one I like best of all. Fagles is jolly good as well. I studied Latin between the ages of 7 and 15, and I couldn't even ask you to light my cigarette in. I'm not that I smoke cigarettes, but I couldn't ask anybody to light a cigarette in Latin. I mean, it's just evaporated. I suppose the grid of it might be in my mind somewhere, and I certainly know what Latinate language sounds like, which is worth knowing, especially if we're reading Middleton.
Andrew, I was so struck by your description of being sent away so young, and your notion of time away and time at home and this elegiac thing that was set up in your mind. And I wondered if the same fate had been, I wonder if your brother Kit had also been sent away and how he coped with it.
That's a very sweet question. He was, and I would say that he was quite severely, I mean, I hope he wouldn't mind me saying this, I don't think he would. I think he was probably quite severely damaged by it. I don't honestly see how one couldn't be. Though occasionally, very occasionally, I meet people who are at school with me, and they say, I say, how was it for you? And they say, oh, fine. And I say, but you know, you're being beaten all the time, and they say, yeah, but you know, but actually, that's not a good answer. But as you can see, I hope, from the way I put it, it's a slightly peculiar thing to complain about in the sense that it was meant to be an aspect of a privileged background. Well, the other thing, and we mustn't spend too much time talking about this particular thing, but the other thing that is perhaps worth saying is that I think it's worth brooding on the fact that in the days of the British Empire and how the British Empire behaved, most of the people administering it went to that kind of school, and one wonders what the connection is between the sort of set of expectations and the traumas that they went through as kids, and then what they inflicted on the rest of the world.
I hope you're not going to find this question impertinent. But we're at a university and we're encouraged to be curious.
Yes.
I want to know, why did you abdicate from that high position of being poet laureate?
Well, that's not at all an impertinent question. Thank you for it. It slightly misrepresents what happened to say that I abdicated. Actually, what I'd said at the outset, I said I'd do it for 10 years. So it wasn't as though I'd sort of suddenly turned a corner and thought I'd been doing this for 10 years and I'm off. But at the very beginning, it seemed to me a good idea to do it for a limited period, partly because it would allow whoever does the appointing to choose slightly younger people than has happened historically. There have been quite young people appointed in the... I mean, Tennyson was quite young when he was appointed. But then he did it for 49 years. And it seems to me not... And I think after Tennyson had done it for 49 years, the powers that be probably thought maybe a good idea to ask people who are a bit kind of further down the road, because we don't want to get stuck with anybody too long. So partly to sort of move the beam of their attention towards younger people. Partly to give somebody else a go. Partly because as you can see, I'm highly conscious of myself as a particular kind of person. And it ought to be another kind of person, a woman, for instance, as there now is. I felt I could sort of do a lot of things to change it, but I couldn't. Well, I suppose I could have changed myself to a woman, but I chose not to. And those are the main sorts of reasons, I think. Actually, there is one other which takes me a bit close to saying something I don't quite want to say, because I might be patting myself on the back as I say it, but so not in that spirit. I thought if I did it for a limited period, I could really go for it. I could devote myself to it. I would be very energetic about it. It was a post which, if I can say this in a respectful spirit, was badly in need of revision. It just needed dragging into modern times. I thought it crucially needed a sort of advocacy role attached to it. In fact, made central to it, for poetry, for poetry itself. And if you are going to do that, it consumes your life. It was, again, I don't want to sound complaining about it, but it was an exhausting thing to do. And I thought, I'll really try and wallop it for 10 years and then I'll stop and go and do something else. In the immediate aftermath of stopping doing it, I was very, very relieved to give it out. I've made no secret of that over the years. I was very glad to do it and I was very glad to give it out. But at the same time as being glad to give it up, I felt there was a kind of vacuum in my life. I mean, it was a very high-profile thing to be doing. What do you do next? And that was partly why I was very keen to get involved with the CPRE, the Campaign to Protect Rural England, because that's something that's very dear to my heart. And again, it's something which required a lot of advocacy. The CPRE, I just quickly want to say, doesn't exist to say, let's not build any more houses. I mean, it exists to have a serious conversation with the government about being appropriately up to date, but doing things in a way that look after the country, of which we haven't got very much. And because I now live in America, I can see what an unregulated building program does to a country. I mean, it's just a mess. So I got very involved in all that. And then the time came when I was invited to go and work in the Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and I thought it doesn't happen to many people to reinvent themselves in their early 60s, so what a great thing to do. Eliot says old men should be explorers. It felt like a very good way to go and be an explorer. And it's been fantastic. I absolutely love being there. I miss lots of things in England. I miss my dear friends. I miss my kids. But it's only 5 hours away. So...
You spoke of all the English or poets who greatly influenced you. Now that you're in America, can you name any American poets who might also have a profound impact?
Yes, absolutely. And they kind of, I should have, I mean, if it were a different kind of lecture, I might have talked about that. I did read, of course, quite a lot of American poets when I was coming to poetry at the beginning. There's more, there's not much, but there is more. It's, in those days, pre-internet days, it was probably easier to read American poets in England than it was to read English poets in America. So Robert Lowell, Berryman, I mean that generation, Elizabeth Bishop, let alone the great mighty dead poets, Frost, Whitman. They were very important to me, and actually they've become even more important to me now that I live there. Actually, especially Emily Dickinson, whom I've always loved, but somehow reading her there feels different, now that I've been to her house and kind of thing. So I read a lot of great dead American poets, and I suppose the three that I read most are Dickinson and Frost and Elizabeth Bishop, whom I absolutely revere. And then there's the great Niagara roar of contemporary American poetry, which is almost overwhelming. And I've been there 2 years now, and I read my eyes out trying to keep up with it. But I still feel that I hardly know my way around it. But I can say one thing about it, perhaps, which is interesting, or has struck me, which is that the default setting of contemporary American poetry is on identity politics. And there is a great deal of stuff being written in America now, for very good reason, by people who want to explore their heritage and also want to assert what kind of person they are in the great tapestry of American life. And that, as I've already suggested, in principle, it seems to be a very good thing. However, if the impetus to write about that subject means that it leads you to a place where you simply say what kind of ethnicity you have and what baggage it might bring with it and opportunities, and you think that's enough to make a poem just by saying it, that's a mistake. I mean, in other words, it needs transfiguring and lifting and get your imagination working on it, that kind of thing. So I spend a lot of time with my students saying, what you say is very interesting, but it isn't yet a poem. And I want to say that to a lot of the stuff that I'm reading in print as well. Yes, sorry. Anybody else? Yes, yes.
How do we make poetry more accessible for everyone? I'm trying to do this in my job, and it is sometimes an uphill struggle because people think that Middleton and Wordsworth aren't for them. It's elitist, it's for the highly educated, the privileged. And I'm passionate about bringing Middleton to ordinary people. And I forgive me using the word ordinary. What I mean by that is everybody.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So do you have any ideas about this? Because I feel very strongly that we need to do something about the sort of elitist tag around poetry.
Yes, quite. Well, I absolutely recognise the thing that you're talking about. It was my sort of daily thought when I was laureating, because I tried to do something about the very thing that you're talking about. And what I'm about to say is something that many other people will have told you. I wish I did have a magic answer to give you. At the very beginning, it doesn't matter to me at all what the kids are reading, or whatever age they are, what they're reading. Just get them into the palace of poetry via whatever door they're prepared to go through. And then when they're in there, begin a conversation with them about how this is where you came in. Now you're in this extraordinary sort of collection of rooms. And in that room that is going on, that kind of poetry is going on, and in that room that kind of poetry is going on. And they're all dead in there. But if you like that, you might like that, and so on and so on and so on. And do whatever one can to see the joined upness of this, because even the coolest new poet on the block has some sense of living in a tradition. And they may not know everything about the tradition. Nobody knows everything about the tradition. But I think it's, for any kind of poet in the great rainbow of poetries that we now live with, whatever kind of poet you are, you benefit from knowing more about the brothers and sisters that you're writing it who are writing or have written it around you. So just to see it as not the act of poetry as a kind of joined up a thing as you possibly can. That seems to me the best way to go with it. And having said all that, Middleton will not be for everybody. So relax. I mean, it means a lot to me, and it means a lot to you, but nothing is for everybody. You were going to say something?
Okay, one more question. Thank you. It's been really lovely listening to you speak and to speak what you've written. And I know that during your laureateship, one of the greatest legacies of that is the Poetry Archive. And I just wondered if you could speak to us a little bit about the relationship between the written word and the spoken word.
Sure.
And
well, that's
orality.
Thank you. That's a very nice question, and sort of in and of itself, but also because it actually connects with what you and I were just talking about a minute ago, I think, which is to say that I'm devoutly of the opinion, and I'm sure everybody else in the room is of the same view about this, that however we reckon that we might coax the meaning out of a poem, wherever meaning is in a poem, it has as much to do with what the words mean when we see them written down on a page and what they mean when we look them up in the dictionary as it does with the effect that they have in our ear. The ear is the best reader, Robert Frost says, and I absolutely agree with that. And it was really to demonstrate that I and my friend Richard Carrington set up the Poetry Archive, and even allowing for the fact that it's quite a handy tool for people teaching in school and so on, which I hope it is, because there's lots of editorial on the site that is designed to be useful to teachers and to the students. The great hope is that by hearing it aloud, they will be able to enter its world. But the other point that's perhaps very quickly worth making is that when I was trying to talk in my talk about the connection between knowing and not knowing in the act of writing a poem, knowing what you're up to and not knowing what you're up to, that's of course the reader of poetry's experience as well. I mean, quite often, don't we all, when we're reading a poem, think, I love that, even before we've begun to understand it. I mean, that's partly what I mean about this recognition thing. You just think, yeah. And gradually you understand it better, and you put some sort of significant meaning into that, yeah, feeling, that enormous yes. And listening to poems allows that to become dramatized. In other words, I quite often listen to poems thinking, a lot of that's kind of gone whizzing past me, but nevertheless I felt a kind of shudder of assimilation, early assimilation, recognition in the process. And I think to get children, since we were talking about children, to relax enough to feel that is crucial and potentially wonderful. The ear is the best reader. That's how we understand it. I'm going to end by telling you a joke, actually, which bears, well, a sort of joke. Which bears very directly on the thing we're talking about here, and then I'll shut up. I'm a keen bird watcher, and I read lots of books about birds, and I was reading a bird book not so long ago in which there was a story about a starling that was being kept in a lab on the west coast in the States. And starlings are very good mimics, as we all know. So it was overhearing a lot of the lab activity. And one day it got a claw infection. It wasn't chatting away much, but it was listening, had been listening. One day it got a claw infection, and they called in a vet to give it a shot at something, would clear up this infection. And this guy appeared wearing a white coat with a horrible-looking hypodermic in one hand. And he picked up the bird, and as he was about to give it its shot, the bird said, "I have a question." Which it had obviously heard people saying in the lab in a slightly anxious cadence when they couldn't understand something or they wanted to take something further. So the bird wasn't speaking English suddenly. The bird was making a set of noises which meant to it the feeling that it was having. And what hearing a poem aloud does is that. It's a set of noises which is equivalent to an emotional state. So I have a question.